Hello and welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I am Ryan McMakin with the Mises Institute, and with me again is my associate editor, Tho Bishop. Now, we've been talking a lot about election stuff and populism in recent weeks, and let's take a break from that. This week, let's talk about the most undemocratic, most unresponsive, most elitist organization you can imagine, something that has nothing to do with populism, something that actively works against the well-being of most voters, something that exists to enrich the ruling class. And I am speaking of America's central bank, the Federal Reserve System. And so let's talk a little bit about that, what's going on, who's going to be in charge of it in the near future, and how central the Fed is going to be to ensuring that the United States can continue to pay interest on its massive debt. So the big item in recent months was that the Biden administration plans to appoint Janet Yellen as the head of Treasury. And it seems that the Treasury Secretary anymore, that his or her main job seems to be about getting money from the Fed and managing the relationship between Treasury and the Fed. And it's hard to see how anything will be different, really, looking at the relationship between Mnuchin and Powell. I don't see any big change coming. What do you think, though?
I don't see it at all either. I mean, Mnuchin was always one of those hires that from the start, it was a disaster. He was a former Goldman Sachs guy himself. Before he got into Hollywood, he had a very interesting record on as a producer for various Warner Brothers films. Was with a kind of a middle-sized bank that had some interesting issues during the financial crisis. Before really lucking out as a major fundraiser for Trump during his 2016 campaign and leveraging that into that Treasury gig. I do know he made a real tragedy there is the opportunity of what could have been there. He did talk to, I know, John Allison, the former head of BB&T Bank, who wrote some very interesting book, one of the best books on the financial crisis, in my opinion. So Mnuchin was kind of definitely a tip to the hat. Again, Goldman Sachs always tends to win these elections, no matter who the candidate is, and that was certainly the case there. And I think that Yellen is going to be a continuation of the status quo. I mean, she is being hailed as a great historic choice because of her gender. She is now the first woman Treasury Secretary as well as Fed Chair. Again, it's interesting because the big fetish in D.C. circles in terms of economic policies, the importance of maintaining that independence of the Fed. And yet now when you have a revolving door between the Fed and the Treasury, in fact, I think that the next Fed chairman is a partisan, Lael Brainard, who's a former Treasury official herself. It becomes a revolving door between the two entities, which makes sense considering how the two have been operating in practice for many, many years.
Yeah, I get one of the things that I confess I got a kick out of in recent years is Zero Hedge would do this thing where whenever it seemed like the stock market was lacking, they throw up on Twitter a picture of Mnuchin on the phone. And presumably this meant Mnuchin got on the phone and called Powell and said, juice the stock market to make sure it keeps going. And so like every afternoon, there'd just be a picture of Mnuchin up there on the phone with Powell saying, let the money fly, keep it going. And of course, I'm sure the situation was slightly more complex and sophisticated like that. But the reality, of course, is, as you say, there's not really a disconnect between the political institution that is Treasury and the presidency and the ostensibly non-political institution that is the Fed. And that brings us to why would we think anything would change, right? There's nothing about Fed policy right now that's based on some sort of deep scientific thinking, and we studied the situation and we determined this is what the Fed should do. No, it's obvious that Fed policy is hit the panic button, get the money going. That's what we got to do. Just get us to the next crisis. And that's clearly been the issue since 2008 is there's a crisis, print the money, get us to the next crisis. Just get us through so that the system doesn't implode and so that billionaires and the ruling classes aren't held accountable for some sort of economic disaster.
Within our circles, I mean, it's natural for us to kind of laugh at how obviously screwed up this entire system is. But again, I think one of the interesting things about politics today is that increasingly you have normal people kind of see, when DC and New York and the media is saying one thing, mostly peaceful protests while the building behind them is on fire, right? When they are trying to say something and it's so blatantly untrue, that's when a loss of legitimacy goes much broader than your actual view on the issue itself. It's just that you can't trust these people. Again, every single the line about Fed independence is something that is brought up every single year. The hearings about Judy Shelton, who again does not look like she's going to squeeze in there right before the change of administrations there. Every single issue there was about the importance of Fed independence. We know for a fact this is a lie. Okay, there's diaries of former Fed chairman where they talk about going over without anybody else knowing, going to the White House and engaging in deals on what the Fed is going to do directly with the executive branch. There's one of the big ideas during the Bush family had a major issue with Greenspan because Greenspan intentionally didn't do what the Fed is supposed to do going into the 92 election, and that's what gave Bill Clinton the press. I mean, this is widely known that these Fed officials do not act independent of politics, and yet they pound the table on this point. So these are the same people who say, well, America's never defaulted on its debt. It's like, we saw that play out in the 70s and issues before that. The modern financial system is the politicians are lying day in, day out. And then this is, again, I don't think this is particularly surprising to our audience, but it's so commonplace that it is worth kind of just highlighting just how absurd the entire thing is.
I blame a bit the dominance of economists among experts that the media trusts. So whenever anything involving the Fed comes up, people dial up an economist and they want to know what's the Fed doing and how will the Fed respond to these political institutions. And they're calling the wrong people. They should be calling political scientists and historians and people who take a critical view of the Fed and actually analyze the real political history of the Fed, because economists, modern day economists, live in sort of this fantasy land where they run their little studies and they have their computer models and they think that economic policy exists somewhat in a vacuum, separate from political institutions, and that human beings in these non-political but actually political institutions like the Fed really make their decisions based on some sort of rational thinking and so on. Now, it's hard to tell if economists actually believe that or if they're just trying to push some sort of party line, but that's certainly what they tell the media, and it's what they tell politicians, and certainly what they seem to tell each other as well, at least in places where it can be overheard. Whereas if you actually search for the best stuff on the history of the Fed and the Fed as a political institution, this is all written by non-economists. And because they appreciate that, of course, the Fed is a political institution. Of course, there's deep political issues behind appointees to the governing board and those sorts of things. And I can't tell if economists are really just that naive or if they really believe it. But the media would be much better off going to non-economists if they wanted to know more about the reality of interactions with the Fed and political institutions. But they don't seem to notice that at all, and we'll continue to head down this imaginary road where the Fed is making decisions based on some sort of science. And as long as that continues, I guess we'll just keep up this mirage of the idea that the Fed isn't making it up as it goes along.
And I think this is exactly why, humor and online memes and things like that, I think it's been particularly effective in the financial sphere. Again, the problem is the majority of the population, they still don't engage with these things at all. But it's so easy to lampoon. That's exactly why Zero Hedge, I think it's so effective. And the amount of readership that Zero Hedge really gets, because people know that you can't trust all these talking heads that are there just to kind of, hey, everyone keep calm. These people know exactly what they're doing. even though, Baghdad Bob financial journalism of CNBC and whatever, they know it doesn't work. And so therefore, when it's so easy to mock and there's so little credibility, you have the zero hedges. And one of my favorite Twitter accounts is Rudy Havenstein, who just lampoons these people because these are it's terrifying that these liars have so much power over the world, because again, you watch the way they talk about these sort of things. Do they even genuinely believe what they're saying? Sometimes I don't even think they do a good job of convincing themselves, much less the public. And that's when you have a loss of faith in institutions. And for example, going back to Janet Yellen, new Treasury Secretary, she was having to go out in front of Congress and saying that forward guidance, which was a policy tool that Ben Bernanke tried to use, where they would use communication tools to try to help influence inflation expectations. Again, it was kind of an informal policy tool of the Fed. And Janet Yellen had to go in front of Congress, I think it was 2014, and saying that basically forward guidance doesn't work anymore because the markets don't trust us, because their predictions were so wrong so consistently. That people stopped believing what the Fed was saying. And again, so that's one of the issues that you have, is that they don't have the sort of credibility that they themselves view as an important policy tool, which is why they end up having to rely upon it. They make stuff up on the fly. And again, typically in ways that benefit those in power at the expense of those without so much power.
Let's take a look at what the Fed actually did under Yellen and this effort at claiming expertise. Well, it was clear the Fed was saying things that were at odds with reality. And what I mean is, for that period from 2009 all the way up to 2016, the Fed never raised interest rates and never scaled back its assets, its portfolio. It basically did nothing to really tighten the money supply or reverse its easy money policies. But at the same time, the Fed was always saying, oh, there's moderate improvement in the economy. The economy is showing some strength. Things are improving. Things are getting better. Always, of course, in this guarded tone, never ever saying that, oh, things are fantastic now, but always saying, oh, things are improving. Things are good. You could tell that this was just them saying, keep calm. We'll just hope for the best. And you could tell, of course, that they didn't actually think anything was improving, because they never allowed the interest rate to inch back up. Of course, I'm speaking of the federal funds rate. And so it just kept going and going. And it wasn't until years after the financial crisis, and we're getting into 2016, 2017, that's then starting to inch up. But even then, the total numbers on the interest rate were tiny. And it wasn't until really 2019 that they even started to then even contemplate and think about taking any real action about scaling back its assets. And that, of course, was the big indicator, right? We bought all this junk in 2009, 2010 to prop up the financial sector and failing banks and so on. And we've been holding that on our books ever since. But we can't ever get rid of it, which means they were essentially monetizing all that debt, all of that time. And they let it then inch up, but still nowhere near where it had been in 2006, 2007, and even farther still below where it had been back in the 90s. So these are very, very low interest rates, even when they might look high, because, oh, wow, it hit 2.5% compared to essentially 0% for almost that decade after 2008. And that was Yellen. We say everything's fine. We say in a very serious voice that things are showing moderate improvement and so on. But of course, they by their actions, they show they didn't think that at all, and were clearly too frightened to do anything, to try and do anything that might be interpreted as really being a inflation hawk in any way. It was just all dovish policy the whole time, and then the most tentative steps. And so with her at Treasury, it's just going to be more easy money, I think, is the safe bet. And even though I think that some people thought that Powell was going to be some sort of hard money guy, relatively, when he came to the Fed, that certainly was obviously not how things turned out.
Okay, how dare us question the independence of the Fed? But the first time that the Fed actually increased interest rates, I believe, if I remember correctly, came in December of 2016, when there happened to be quite a political event in November of 2016. And I think this is going to be one of the larger interesting narratives of the Biden administration, is that, we're here dunking on Yellen because we think she's an obvious dupe, just like most of these people are. But to the left, there's a lot of criticism because she is far too hawkish for their taste in terms of inflation, because they didn't do more. As Fed chair for most of her time, she kind of kept the status quo. Whereas people were saying that, we haven't seen nearly enough economic growth. And of course they always wrap it into, certain demographic A is not benefiting enough, and we need to be more conscious of demographic B, and what we really need at the Fed is more superficial diversity. They criticize her for not doing enough. And I think that you're going to continue to see that. So she's being already pigeonholed into that quote unquote neoliberal centrist label. When again, if you look at what her term as Fed chair was, what her general philosophy is relative to what used to be seen as normality in a post 2008 world. I mean, it's so disconnected. But again, she's not far enough for a lot of the voting base. A lot of the support that Biden had to rely upon going into the election. And so it would not surprise me if you see people like the AOCs of the world being very trying to push her a lot in this new role. Because again, they don't think that she has done nearly enough to she's been far too frugal in their mindset.
This is an important thing to never forget, right? Is that on the left, there are countless people who think that at some point in the late 70s or maybe early 80s, that hardcore free market libertarians took over planet Earth. And they call these people neoliberals a lot of time. And I know that some libertarians and those sorts of people argue over what neoliberal means. But the reality is that if you're on the left, what neoliberal means is extreme free market partisans. And when they say neoliberal, they mean hardcore libertarian in their minds. And they think these people run all the institutions. They run the Fed, they run the Treasury, they run the Congress, and the left has been shunted aside and is being ruled over by these free market, rock bottom tax rate people who are running society into the ground so that we can maximize profit. And so, keep in mind that, to them, Yellen looks like some sort of stooge of the far right. And of course, we have a different view of that. But yes, I completely agree. Always keep that in mind. In fact, you and I should do a whole episode on this in the future, on what neoliberalism means to the left and how this is an important group out there that thinks hardcore libertarians run the planet.
Yeah, and there's some interesting stuff out there. In my experience, so anybody who self-identifies as neoliberal, it's usually the most obnoxious form of moderate libertarian out there. It's like the Adam Smith Institute people that were very anti-Brexit. There's some fine people at Adam Smith. I'm not trying to paint them all with a broad brush, but it's like the people that really love to kind of dig in on how cosmopolitan and elitist they are, while making all of these compromising gestures to the state. But again, they've been packaged that neoliberal world is used by academia, left academia, this entire genre of kind of really conspiratorial history on the left, as you can blame them for everything from the dominance of Wall Street to child slavery. I mean, it's everything is packaged into a very neat package there.
And so don't forget that side of the narrative. The other side of the narrative, of course, was what Trump was up to before he was president. Right. So as you insinuated, there might have been something behind the fact that the Fed didn't allow interest rates to inch up until the election was passed. And of course, Trump, while he was a candidate, was dissing the Fed and making very Ron Paulian sorts of comments about how the Fed impoverishes the middle class for the benefit of the rich and stuff. That was back when Trump was good on the Fed. And then he does a total about-face. Once he's president, he just wants to keep the boom going. We're getting out to 2018, 2019, and then he's just pushing Powell even publicly. Open the money spigots, keep it going, keep the boom going, print the money, just do whatever it takes. And then as happens with Trump supporters, they take all their cues from whatever Trump says on Twitter. So whatever anti-Fed, populist, true, responsible money creation issues they might have followed back under candidate Trump, they just pitched that all out the door and completely forgot about it. And then the Fed was fine. Just print the money, just keep the boom going. All that really matters is getting Trump reelected. And so we don't care anymore. And then the other aspect of that, of course, is just the gigantic budget deficit, which is technically separate from the Fed. But the Fed is what makes it possible. The Fed is how you can have, as we had in 2020, a $3.1 trillion deficit, which is really basically triple the previous record-breaking deficit, maybe more, maybe just a little more than double, going back to 2009, 2010 or so. But without the Fed, you would have to raise interest rates in order to attract enough money to the U.S. debt, get people buying up enough security or enough U.S. debt bonds so that the interest rate doesn't have to go way up. And we've got the Fed there, though, to monetize essentially that debt, to buy up a bunch of those bonds, to grease the skids and keep that money going and keep demand for U.S. debt out there. Then that makes it possible for those huge, huge deficits. And of course, Trump and his supporters loved that. They had no problem with these $1 trillion bailouts that occurred with the COVID crisis. And of course, just nonstop spending, $750 billion spending on defense budgets. And you need the Fed to do that. And so it's clear that the whole Trump enterprise then became very closely wed to the idea of easy money through the Fed.
So the problem is, too, is that, again, what I thought was very interesting about Trump's comments during the 2016 campaign is not only was he attacking the Fed for being in Obama's pocket, which I think is probably true. He did some interviews like CNBC where it was like really good stuff. He talked about saying, look, as a real estate guy, I love low interest rates because it makes it easier for me to build new stuff. But like the working people, they're the ones that have done it the right way. They're the ones getting screwed over because they can't get any return on their money. And he's right about that. It was surprisingly good because what's interesting in recent years, a lot of politicians have kind of picked up on the fact that there is this kind of sound money a political constituency out there, so they try to pitch to it. I mean, I don't think Newt Gingrich was really serious about going to the gold standard, but like Newt Gingrich would make sure to bring it up. Ben Carson would go ahead and bring it up. Ted Cruz did, and so it doesn't translate to policy necessarily, but it's good to be pandered to. I mean, it's a sign of political relevance, if nothing else. But it creates an interesting issue that, okay, well, if you do recognize the consequences of the Fed's policy, and you get the keys to the castle, what do you do there? Because obviously, you think back, you look at throughout history. I mean, Martin Van Buren. I mean, that was one of Murray Rothbard's favorite presidents of all time. Martin Van Buren was done in part due to a economic crisis caused by the consequences of the behavior of the second bank of the United States. It's kind of difficult. Like, when you could identify a bubble and you want to get reelected, popping it is an issue. And I think this is one of the issues that this is what, like, for me, like, as time has gone on, it's important to highlight because there is such people do get screwed over when you have massive spending, right? It's ultimately you take it from one class and you give it to a politically connected class. But what's clear, though, is that it doesn't matter who the politician is if there is no political will for cutting a budget. And for example, like if you look at the Trump era, there is some nuance that you could argue there because the Trump administration budgets were always, I mean, the problem is it's a ceremonial act, right? And the president doesn't get to really control the budget, but all of his budgets had some very interesting cuts in it. Not enough. It was loaded full of defense spending, obviously, but like the Trump administration budgets had some good stuff. Then it goes to Congress, and the Congress is a total circus. Right, that's when everyone's trying to get everything in there, and became and then Trump's just there trying to get deals. They didn't want the Republicans. They've kind of gotten burnt enough times, and I know there was one major shutdown during Trump's tenure, but Republicans kind of recognize that taking a hard line on spending issues doesn't play well for them politically. And so I don't think that there's any you could elect the best president ever. you could resurrect Sam Tilden and put him in there in the office. I don't think that you're going to get any sort of real pushback on government spending, which is why I think the interesting stuff is kind of Rothbard's old stuff, and Peter Klein's written about this. I have a few articles about it as well, about the real discussion that we should be having is less about cutting spending because it's a political impossibility as it stands now, but the inevitability of defaulting of the debt. That there is no way of paying any of this stuff back because of where we're at. And I think that when we start recognizing, now again, that doesn't. After you do that, then the ability of spending as you work becomes much more difficult, right? You're the people that used to be buying up debt. You have significant changes that happen there. But again, I think this is one of these eras where we can talk about cutting spending and reform on the margins all we want. The political system is not set up for that, and so it's only the sort of thing we're kind of cutting that Gordian knot in the future is more default than it is spending reform. And again, I think I think it's similar with the way the dollar is. We want to try to preserve lifeboats away from the dollar rather than trying to say, oh, well, if only we embrace rules-based monetary policy, the Fed's going to run so much more efficiently, right? These institutions are so utterly corrupt. This is a clown world that is governing our economic policy. The best thing we can do is identify it for the absurdity that it is and try to protect ourselves when these inevitable consequences really do come. Again, because the idea that a few elections of the right people are going to solve it is again, we've seen how that plays out, and it doesn't work out well in practice.
Yes, I think in terms of the political narrative, you need either a serious crisis or you need a significant change in ideology. I know that people who criticize democracy claim that it always and everywhere leads to just massive inflations and spending. And that's not necessarily the case. The U.S. was thoroughly democratic right up until the 1930s when people were still running on FDR in his first election that he won was still running on the issue of cutting debt and cutting spending. And it wasn't really until the Keynesian takeover that it really went in the opposite direction. And it was then when the regime could cloak itself in this mantle of economic science that spending is fabulous and you can just do deficit spending forever and it never matters, right up until Dick Cheney decides the deficits don't matter at all. And there's not really time here to explain what the problem is, but it's clear that the public sees that, yep, you can keep it going forever. Of course, the reality is what stops that is once international faith in the dollar starts to decline, which doesn't look like it's going to happen the day after tomorrow. That's more of a medium or long-term event. That's when you have to start worry. But if the more you inflate, the more the problems multiply that you have to deal with after the fact. Also, there's just the fact that inflation, deficit spending is really a wealth transfer from some people to others. And it's all enabled by the Fed. It really does increase inequality. It really helps billionaires while hurting people on fixed incomes and small savers and small business people. And I think that's somewhat the answer to your question right there is how do you start to get it so that you just don't go to the Fed and say, hey, print the money and I can't do anything to rein in spending or oppose the Fed because the public would have a problem with that. I think what you need is some sort of brilliant person and amazingly successful political person. This all assumes, of course, the U.S. remains a single country for the duration. But someone in that role would have to really gain the public's imagination and really show that the central bank is, in fact, the enemy, that it's really billionaires against you, and that if the economy does collapse, it's the Fed's fault. You need to somehow convince the public to see the Fed as the instrument of booms, busts, and the economic collapse that has ruined your life. And until you can really paint the Fed that way successfully, yes, I think they continue to benefit from all this nonsense about how they're non-political and how the real problem are the political institutions. And people just believe that. People really have bought into that myth.
And to the point, I think this is really kind of the core of what a lot of our previous episodes have been on the value of populism, because like that is the mechanism to try to make that narrative mainstream and to hit it right there. And again, when you have Tucker Carlson out there and those types, and I don't want to target him in particular, but a lot of their concerns and their criticisms about the consolidation of wealth and the way that the working class people are being screwed over is absolutely correct. But again, if that analysis doesn't take into account the Fed, it's worthless. It's superficial, and I think it's very interesting. One of the kind of at the very end when Judy Shelton's nomination failed because literally, it's because of COVID that Judy Shelton is not a Fed is not on the Federal Board or Federal Reserve Board. You had Rick Scott and Grassley. Sorry, Senator Grassley. I think both of them ended up being quarantined. The vote lost by a single Republican vote. They needed both those to pass the nomination. What's interesting, and this is kind of a bad sign, is that going into that vote, you started seeing tweets from people like Ann Coulter, who have been leading figures on kind of this national populist sort of right stuff, that were attacking Shelton's nomination because of Shelton's views on immigration. And again, I'm not trying to that's a separate issue entirely, but it's really short-sighted. If and this is not to say that Judy Shelton was going to save the Fed, right? I mean, Judy Shelton was an unusually interesting Federal Reserve nominee. She would have provided some sincere intellectual diversity, right? She's not an Austrian. She's not the solution per se, but it was an interesting battle where here was someone who had openly criticized the PhD standard, who's friends with James Grant, who compared the Fed to communist central planners. All of this was very good criticism. She didn't have necessarily all the answers. And again, she was within one vote on the board. I mean, that wouldn't have changed things dramatically. But when you start picking at an economist like that because of issues that really don't go to the Fed and ignoring the fact that, okay, like she's unusually good at questioning this institution that pays directly to one of your major issues, it shows where, again, I mean, it's some of the criticism of, I think it was Hoppe that has an article criticizing the Pat Buchanan's era conservatives, where these people they talk about their concerns about social conservatism, but if you do not combine that with an understanding of economics, then you end up calling for the subsidized public schooling and all these organisms that end up providing and defending the narrative that you're trying to raise a culture war against, right? And so that's why you need economics if you are going to be a good drain the swamp, America first populist, because it's what shows you exactly what are the institutions of the problem. And again, as long as you have that disconnect, then you can rail about vulture capitalists on Fox News all you want. You're not going to get to the crux of the matter. And again, and then look at the one thing that America has had going for it, and this is going to, I think, one of the issues that libertarians often have is that we focus on what our country does wrong, and we kind of we don't say as informed or what all the other countries do. I mean, the biggest thing that's been bailing out the Fed is the fact that our policy has been adapted and sometimes amplified by the ECB, by the Bank of Japan, by even the Swiss bank. That's been the only thing that's been able to keep us as world leader. Because if we were alone and engaging in this absurd clown world monetary policy, then we'd be in a very difficult situation. We're not, though. We just happen to be the one that's been outsourcing these ideas elsewhere, and so again, we look good by comparison. It's a crazy world. But again, if you don't, that is precisely why a focus on monetary policy and the institutions that make it up is so important, which is why we do what we do.
Well, so I guess the answer to our question then at the beginning is, what do we expect from the Fed? I think the answer is more of the same.
More bad.
Yeah. Even with Biden in office, I wouldn't expect anything more serious than an occasional comment about the gold standard or big debt or something like that. Mitch McConnell, who's getting ready to put his seal of approval on another almost $1 trillion bailout and stimulus program. He's not going to do anything about it. There's going to be a handful of House people who express those ideas, but that's it. There's not the intellectual underpinning behind it, and the people who claim to be in opposition to the establishment, they don't understand enough of how the Fed works or what it does to even identify who the bad guys are and why they're bad and what they're doing and how you're getting screwed. They're just not interested enough. It doesn't require much brain power to just hate on immigrants. I mean, Ann Coulter's not a serious person, never has been. She plays a character. As far as I can tell, she actually spends all her time hanging out with hardcore leftists and dating them and cultivating their approval in their company. So she just figured out how to squeeze money out of the rubes for her books. And that's why she ends up criticizing people like Judy Shelton, because her ideology on a specific issue that has virtually nothing to do with being on the Fed Board of Governors doesn't line up with her trademark issue that makes her money. And I would expect more of that sort of thing from the right and from Republicans on this. So, yeah, get ready for 2021. If you already did 2020, then you'll recognize 2021 quite a bit. Don't expect things to improve immensely on January 1. So thank you for joining us for Radio Rothbard this time. We'll be back next week with more. And until then, have a wonderful week.